I'm Margaret Sullivan, 67, and until 3 months ago, I was a retired financial advisor with a net worth of $2.3 million and a mind sharper than most people half my age. But my own family, my daughter Karen, and son-in-law David convinced 3 different doctors that I was losing my memory, my judgment, my very sanity, while I sat in sterile medical offices, answering questions designed to make me look confused. They were systematically draining my accounts, selling my properties, and stealing my life's work. The worst part, I knew exactly what they were doing, but every time I tried to speak up, they'd exchange those knowing glances and whisper about Mom's condition getting worse. Little did they know, I was documenting everything. If you've ever been betrayed by family, you'll want to hear this story. Like and subscribe because what I did next changed everything. Karen was my miracle baby, born when I was 37, and had long given up hope of motherhood. After years of failed pregnancies and heartbreak, she arrived like a gift from heaven, perfect, healthy, and absolutely adored. Perhaps that was my first mistake. I spoiled her. There's no denying it. When other parents were setting boundaries, I was saying yes to everything Karen wanted. Designer clothes, private schools, dance lessons, piano lessons, art classes, whatever caught her fancy. My husband Robert used to warn me about creating a monster, but I couldn't help myself. She was our only child, our precious late-in-life blessing. Robert died when Karen was 15, leaving me to navigate her teenage years alone. The life insurance money went straight into her college fund, along with most of my savings. I wanted her to have everything I never could: an Ivy League education, connections, opportunities. She studied business at Columbia, living in a luxury apartment I couldn't really afford, wearing clothes that cost more than my monthly mortgage. Karen met David during her senior year. He was charming, ambitious, and came from a wealthy Connecticut family, or so he claimed. I had my doubts from the beginning. Something about his smile felt calculated, like he was always performing. But Karen was head over heels, and I bit my tongue. I'd already lost her father. I couldn't bear to lose her to Dot. Their wedding cost me $40,000. I liquidated my emergency fund and took out a loan against my house. Karen insisted on the Plaza Hotel, the designer dress, the elaborate reception. "This is my one special day, Mom," she'd say whenever I suggested something more modest. "Don't you want me to be happy?" After the wedding, things changed. Karen's calls became less frequent, always rushed. When she did visit, she'd make subtle comments about my house being too big for one person, or how I was getting older and might need help managing my finances. David would nod along, throwing in observations about my forgetfulness that I never remembered having. I started keeping a journal then, though I didn't fully understand why. Something felt off about their sudden interest in my well-being. These were the same people who'd been too busy to call for months. Yet now they were concerned about my memory, my driving, my ability to live independently. The first real warning sign came during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. I'd prepared the meal as I had for decades: turkey, stuffing, all the traditional sides. But when Karen arrived, she looked around my kitchen with disapproval. "Mom, you left the stove on," she said, though I distinctly remembered turning it off. "I don't think so, honey. David, come look at this." She called her husband over dramatically. She could have burned the house down. I checked the stove. The burner was indeed on, but I absolutely knew I hadn't left it that way. The doubt in their eyes, the concerned glances they exchanged, made me question myself for the first time in my life. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Something's not right. I'm not losing my mind, but they want me to think I am." The incidents started happening more frequently after that Thanksgiving. Little things at first: items moved from where I'd left them, appointments I supposedly made, but had no memory of, conversations Karen claimed we'd had that never took place. "Mom, remember when you asked me to help you organize your finances?" she'd say during her weekly visits. which had suddenly become much more regular. You said you were having trouble keeping track of everything. I hadn't said any such thing. My financial records were meticulous 40 years. As a financial advisor had ingrained organization into my very DNA. But Karen would produce a notebook with my handwriting, or show me a text message from my phone that I didn't remember sending. The gaslighting was subtle, but relentless. David started joining Karen for these visits, always carrying a small notebook where he'd jot down my concerning behaviors. When I asked what he was writing, he'd smile that calculating smile and say, "Just keeping track of things for your own good, Mom." They began testing my memory in ways that seemed casual, but felt increasingly invasive. "What did you have for breakfast this morning? Do you remember what we talked about last week? Can you tell me what year it is?" Each question felt like a trap, and when I answered correctly, which I always did, they'd exchange those meaningful glances. That made me feel like I was failing some invisible test. My friend Eleanor noticed the change first. We'd been meeting for coffee every Tuesday for 15 years, but suddenly Karen was scheduling doctor appointments and errands during our regular time. "Margaret, I'm worried about you," Eleanor said during one of our brief phone calls. "You sound different, stressed." I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I explain that my own daughter seemed to be orchestrating some kind of psychological campaign against me? It sounded paranoid, even to my own ears. "Karen thinks I should see a doctor," I confided finally. "She's concerned about my memory." "Your memory? Margaret, you remember things from 40 years ago like they happened yesterday. What's she talking about?" But before I could answer, Karen appeared at my door for one of her unannounced visits. She had a key now. When had I given her a key? She claimed I'd asked her to check on me while I was recovering from a cold I didn't remember having. The isolation was gradual, but systematic. Phone calls were interrupted. Social engagements were canceled due to health concerns. My mail started going missing: bills, statements, letters from friends. When I questioned Karen about it, she'd produce the missing items with a concerned expression. "You put these in the refrigerator, Mom. Don't you remember?" I didn't remember because I hadn't done it, but the evidence was there, in my own handwriting, in my own refrigerator. Was I losing my mind? The doubt was the worst part, the way it crept in during quiet moments and made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. I started keeping my journal hidden, writing entries in different places throughout the house. I documented every strange incident, every conversation that didn't feel right, every time something appeared or disappeared without explanation. The pattern was becoming clear, even if I couldn't yet understand the motive. One evening, Karen announced that she'd made an appointment for me with Dr. Morrison, a neurologist she'd researched carefully. "It's just a routine checkup, Mom. Nothing to worry about. I just want to make sure you're healthy." But nothing about Karen's behavior felt routine anymore. The appointment was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the intervening days wondering if I was walking into some kind of trap. I was beginning to understand that I was. Dr. Morrison's office felt more like a courtroom than a medical facility. Karen had insisted on coming with me, positioning herself strategically where she could see both the doctor and me, ready to help with any questions I might struggle to answer. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Morrison began, consulting a thick file that seemed surprisingly comprehensive for a first visit. "Your daughter has expressed some concerns about recent changes in your behavior and memory. Can you tell me how you've been feeling lately?" I felt fine, sharp, alert, completely myself. But before I could answer, Karen leaned forward with that practiced expression of loving concern she'd perfected. "Doctor, she's been having trouble with simple tasks. Last week, she couldn't remember how to use the washing machine, and she's been putting things in strange places. I found her car keys in the freezer just yesterday. The washing machine incident never happened. I'd been doing laundry for 50 years without assistance. And those car keys, I distinctly remembered placing them on the kitchen counter, right where I always left them. But here was my daughter, my own flesh and blood, telling a medical professional these elaborate lies, with tears in her eyes. Is that accurate, Mrs. Sullivan? Dr. Morrison asked, making notes in his file. I don't recall having any trouble with the washing machine, I said carefully, and I'm quite certain I didn't put my keys in the freezer. Karen's face crumpled, with what looked like genuine distress. See, doctor, this is what I mean. She doesn't remember these episodes at all. It's like they never happened for her. The questions that followed felt like an interrogation, disguised as a medical exam. What year was it? Who was the president? What did I have for breakfast? Simple questions with obvious answers, but somehow Karen managed to inject doubt into each response. Actually, Mom, you had oatmeal this morning, not eggs, remember? I made it for you, because you were confused about how to work the stove. I remembered making myself scrambled eggs at 7:30, same as I did every morning. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table, reading the newspaper, drinking my coffee from the blue mug that had been Robert's favorite. But Karen's version of events sounded so detailed, so concerned, so believable. Dr. Morrison conducted cognitive tests, drawing clocks, remembering word lists, solving simple puzzles. I passed every single one with ease, but somehow Karen managed to spin even my successes into cause for concern. She's always been good at covering up her confusion, Karen explained, when I correctly identified all the pictures and answered every question. She gets agitated when she can't remember things, so she makes up stories to fill in the gaps. The examination felt endless. Blood pressure, reflexes, more questions about my daily routine, my ability to manage finances, whether I felt safe living alone. Through it all, Karen provided a running commentary of fabricated incidents and manufactured concerns. When Dr. Morrison finally finished his assessment, he sat back with a troubled expression. Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to schedule some additional tests based on what I'm hearing from your daughter, combined with some of the subtle signs I'm observing. I think we should rule out early-stage dementia. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dementia, the label that would justify everything they were planning, whatever that might be. I looked at Karen, expecting to see some flicker of guilt or remorse, but her face showed only relief and gratitude. Thank you, doctor. I've been so worried about her living alone. Is there anything we should be doing in the meantime? I'd recommend that someone check on her regularly. Maybe help with medication management, important decisions, financial matters, just until we know more. Karen nodded eagerly. Of course, David, and I can handle all of that. As we left the office, Karen's arm around my shoulders felt less like support and more like a cage. She chattered cheerfully about making my life easier, helping with bills, ensuring I was safe and cared for. But all I could think about was the look I'd caught in her eyes during the appointment, not concern, but calculation. That night, I wrote in my journal with shaking hands, they're building a case against my sanity. Dr. Morrison believes I'm losing my mind because Karen painted a picture of a confused, helpless woman who doesn't exist. The question is, why? The answer would become clear soon enough, and it would be far worse than I ever imagined. The paperwork appeared on my kitchen table 3 days after the doctor's appointment. Spread out like a feast of legal jargon, I was expected to digest without question. David sat across from me, his laptop open, wearing the expression of someone doing me an enormous favor. Mom, after what Dr. Morrison said, Karen and I think it's time to get your affairs in order, he said, sliding a thick document toward me. This power of attorney will make everything so much easier for you. No more worrying about bills, investments, any of that complicated financial stuff. I picked up the document and began reading. It was comprehensive, granting them authority over every aspect of my financial life: bank accounts, investments, real estate transactions, insurance policies. Everything I'd worked for over 4 decades would be under their control. This seems rather extensive, I said, flipping through the pages. Maybe I should have my lawyer review it first. David's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, with respect, Dr. Morrison was pretty clear about your condition. These kinds of legal documents can be confusing even for people without cognitive issues. We've already had our attorney review everything to make sure it's in your best interest. Their attorney, not mine. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't yet articulate why. Karen appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of tea I hadn't asked for. David's right, Mom. This is just a precaution. You'll still be involved in all the decisions. We'll just handle the paperwork and make sure nothing gets overlooked. The tea tasted bitter, with an aftertaste I couldn't identify. I set it aside and continued reading the document. Hidden within the dense legal language were clauses that essentially stripped me of all financial autonomy. They could sell my house, liquidate my investments, access my retirement accounts, all under the guise of acting in my best interest. What about my house? I asked. This says you could sell it without my consent, only if you needed the money for medical care, Karen said quickly, or if it became unsafe for you to live alone. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. Her reassurance felt hollow. Everything about this felt orchestrated, rushed, like they were racing against some invisible deadline. I thought about the stack of mail that had been misplaced recently, the bank statements I hadn't seen in weeks, the investment reports that Karen claimed were being forwarded to her for safekeeping. I need time to think about this, I said, pushing the papers away. David's patience cracked slightly. Mom, with all due respect, time isn't really on our side here. Dr. Morrison said these cognitive issues tend to progress quickly. If we wait too long, you might not be legally competent to sign anything. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sign now, while you still can, or lose even the illusion of choice later. Over the next week, the pressure intensified. David would arrive with urgent documents that needed immediate signatures. Karen would call multiple times a day, reminding me about bills that needed paying, investments that required attention, decisions that couldn't wait. Just let us handle it, Mom, became her constant refrain. Why stress yourself over these details? I began to understand that my financial independence was disappearing piece by piece. Bank statements stopped arriving altogether. Karen explained that she'd arranged for them to be sent directly to her house to avoid confusion. My investment advisor, Johnny, called less frequently, and when I tried to reach her, Karen would interrupt, taking the phone to discuss my accounts on my behalf. One afternoon, I attempted to access my online banking, only to discover that my password had been changed. When I called the bank, they informed me that my daughter, listed as my power of attorney, had updated the account for security reasons. But I never signed a power of attorney, I told the customer service representative. According to our records, Mrs. Sullivan, the document was notarized and filed last week. Your daughter explained that you'd been having some memory issues and wanted to ensure your accounts were protected. The lie was so smooth, so believable, that even I began to doubt myself. Had I signed something without realizing its implications? Was my memory truly failing? That evening, I searched through every drawer, every file, every possible hiding place for a copy of the document I supposedly signed. I found nothing. No power of attorney, no legal paperwork, no record of granting anyone authority over my finances. But, according to the bank, David's signature was now sufficient to access my accounts. According to my investment firm, Karen could make decisions about my portfolio. According to everyone except me, I had willingly surrendered control of my financial life. I called Eleanor that night, desperate for a reality check. Margaret, you would never sign something like that without reading it carefully, she said immediately. You're the most financially savvy person I know. If you don't remember signing it, then something's very wrong. Her certainty was a lifeline. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being robbed, systematically and legally. by the two people I'd trusted most in the world. The next morning, I discovered that my checkbook was missing from its usual place in my desk drawer. When I asked Karen about it, she produced it. With that familiar expression of gentle concern. "You left it in the bathroom, Mom, right next to the toilet paper. I was worried you might flush it by mistake." I had never, not once in my entire life, taken my checkbook to the bathroom. But there it was, in Karen's hands, along with 3 checks already filled out for household expenses I didn't remember incurring. The small digital recorder I'd purchased at the electronics store felt like both salvation and betrayal in my hands. After 40 years of trusting people's word, I was reduced to secretly recording my own family. But their gaslighting had become so sophisticated, so relentless, that I needed proof, if not for others, then for my own sanity. I hid the device in a decorative bowl on my kitchen counter, activating it whenever Karen and David visited. What I captured over the next 2 weeks shattered the last remnants of my faith in my daughter. "She's getting more suspicious." Karen's voice was clear on the recording from Tuesday afternoon. "Yesterday she asked about the bank statements again. We need to move faster. The second medical opinion will seal it," David replied. "Dr. Chen is expecting us Thursday. I've already briefed him on her symptoms. What if she refuses to go?" "She won't. Not after what I'm putting in her tea." My blood turned to ice. The bitter aftertaste I'd noticed. The slight drowsiness that followed our conversations. The way my thoughts sometimes felt foggy during their visits. It hadn't been my imagination. "You're sure it's undetectable?" Karen asked. "Low-dose sedatives. Nothing dangerous. Just enough to make her seem confused. Maybe a little disoriented. Dr. Chen will see exactly what we need him to see." The casual way they discussed drugging me, their own mother and grandmother's primary caregiver respectively, revealed a level of premeditation that took my breath away. This wasn't opportunistic greed, it was a calculated assault on my autonomy, my dignity, my very identity. I continued recording their visits, building a library of their deceptions. They discussed which properties to sell first, how to liquidate my investment portfolio without triggering tax penalties, which of my possessions might be valuable enough to auction. "The engagement ring alone should get us $50,000, Karen said during one particularly damning conversation. "And Mom's always said she wanted to downsize anyway." I had never said any such thing. My house was my sanctuary, filled with 40 years of memories with Robert. The engagement ring was the last tangible connection to the man who loved me unconditionally. The idea of these 2 vultures picking over my possessions while I was still alive made me physically sick. But the psychological manipulation was even worse than the financial scheming. They were systematically destroying my relationships, isolating me from anyone who might notice what was happening or offer support. Eleanor called again, David mentioned during one recorded conversation. "She's getting persistent. I'll handle." "Eleanor," Karen replied. "A few comments about Mom's paranoid episodes should do it. Maybe mention how she's been accusing people of stealing from her. They were poisoning my friendships with lies, turning my concerns about their behavior into symptoms of mental illness." When Eleanor called less frequently, when other friends seemed distant and worried, it wasn't because they'd lost interest, it was because Karen had convinced them I was becoming paranoid and unstable. The cruelest part was watching Karen perform concern and love whenever others were present, then drop the mask completely when we were alone. During one visit, she spent 20 minutes on the phone with my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, her voice dripping with filial devotion. "Oh yes, she's having good days and bad days. Yesterday she couldn't remember my name for almost an hour. It's heartbreaking, but David and I are committed to taking care of her." Mrs. Patterson had been watching me tend my garden that very morning, chatting coherently about the weather and her grandson's upcoming wedding. There had been no confusion, no memory lapses, no indication of cognitive decline. But now she looked at me with pity instead of friendship. and I understood that Karen's poison was spreading through my entire social network. The recordings revealed their timeline too. They planned to have me declared incompetent within 6 months, sell the house within a year, and move me into a care facility where my isolation would be complete and permanent. Once she's in Shady Oaks, we won't have to worry about her causing problems, David said with chilling matter-of-factness. Those places are good at managing difficult residents. Shady Oaks. I knew that name from my work as a financial advisor. It was where wealthy families warehoused inconvenient relatives, a luxurious prison for people whose only crime was growing old with money. The monthly fees alone would drain my accounts within 5 years, leaving nothing for genuine medical care or actual needs. But perhaps the most revealing recording came late one evening when they thought I was asleep. Their voices drifted up from the living room, where they were going through my personal papers. She never should have had this much money, Karen said bitterly. Do you know what I could have done with my life if I had had access to this kind of wealth in my 20s? She chose to work instead of enjoying herself, David agreed. Now it's our turn. The entitlement in their voices was staggering. They genuinely believed they deserved my life savings more than I did. In their minds, I was already dead, just an inconvenient obstacle, preventing them from claiming their inheritance. That night, I transcribed every damning conversation, cataloged every lie, documented every instance of manipulation and abuse. The woman they were trying to portray as confused and helpless had just compiled a comprehensive case against them. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd spent decades protecting clients' assets from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. I knew every trick, every legal loophole, every way that families could exploit elderly relatives. But more importantly, I now had proof of their conspiracy, recorded in their own voices, documented in their own words. The hunter had become the hunted, and they didn't even know it yet. Dr. Chen's office was even more intimidating than Dr. Morrison's. All polished marble and expensive artwork that screamed prestige and authority. Karen had insisted on scheduling this appointment herself, claiming my condition made me unreliable about keeping track of medical visits. I arrived 15 minutes early, determined to speak with Dr. Chen privately before Karen and David could poison his opinion with their fabricated narrative. But they were already there, huddled in conversation with the receptionist, who nodded sympathetically at whatever story they were spinning. Mrs. Sullivan, the receptionist said with that particular tone people use when speaking to small children or the mentally impaired, your daughter has explained your situation. Don't worry, Dr. Chen is very experienced with patients like you, patients like me. I wasn't even examined yet, and already I'd been categorized, dismissed, reduced to a problem to be managed rather than a person to be helped. Dr. Chen emerged from his office, a distinguished man in his 50s, with kind eyes that immediately shifted to Karen when she introduced herself as my primary caregiver. The dynamic was established before I could object. I was the patient, the problem, the one whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. Mrs. Sullivan, your daughter has shared some concerning information about recent changes in your behavior, Dr. Chen began, settling behind his imposing desk. She mentioned episodes of confusion, memory loss, and some concerning incidents at home. Before I could respond, Karen launched into a rehearsed performance that would have been impressive if it weren't so devastating. She described a mother who wandered around the house at night, who forgot to turn off appliances, who became agitated when questioned about her confusion. Just yesterday, she accused David and me of stealing from her, Karen said, tears welling in her eyes. She's becoming paranoid, suspicious of everyone who's trying to help her. It's breaking my heart. The irony was suffocating. Here was my daughter, literally in the process of stealing everything I owned, crying about my paranoid accusations of theft. Dr. Chen made notes, nodding sympathetically at Karen's emotional display. These personality changes are indeed concerning, he said, then turned to me. Mrs. Sullivan, do you remember making these accusations against your family? I remember expressing concerns about some financial irregularities. I said carefully, my bank statements have been redirected without my knowledge, and I've had difficulty accessing my own accounts. Karen immediately jumped in. Dr. Chen, this is exactly what I mean. She gets these ideas about financial conspiracies. But when I try to help her with her bills, she forgets that she asked for help in the first place. The doctor's examination felt more like a performance than a medical consultation. As he tested my reflexes and cognitive function, Karen provided a running commentary, interpreting my responses through the lens of her manufactured concerns. When I correctly identified the current president, Karen sighed sadly. She has these moments of clarity, but they don't last. An hour from now, she might not remember this conversation at all. When I drew a perfect clock face, David chimed in with, she's always been good at covering up her deficits. She gets very creative when she can't remember things properly. The most insidious part was how my correct answers were twisted into evidence of my condition. My competence became proof of my cunning. My clarity became evidence of my confusion. Every demonstration of my mental acuity was reframed as a symptom of decline. Dr. Chen conducted the same cognitive tests Dr. Morrison had administered: word recall, pattern recognition, problem-solving exercises. I passed them all easily, but somehow my success only seemed to reinforce Karen's narrative about my ability to mask my deficits. The brain is remarkably adaptive, Dr. Chen explained to Karen, while I sat right there, as if I couldn't understand the conversation. Patients in early-stage dementia often develop sophisticated coping mechanisms. They can appear quite normal in structured situations, while struggling significantly in daily life. It was a perfectly circular trap. If I answered questions correctly, it proved I was good at hiding my impairment. If I struggled with anything, it confirmed my decline. There was no way to win because the game was rigged from the start. The turning point came when Dr. Chen asked about my living situation. Before I could respond, David produced a folder of photographs he claimed to have taken at my house. This is what we're dealing with, doctor, he said, spreading the images across the desk. Spoiled food in the refrigerator, unpaid bills scattered everywhere, medications mixed up in unlabeled containers. I stared at the photos in shock. They showed a house I didn't recognize, cluttered, dirty, chaotic. But the furniture was mine. The rooms were familiar. Even some of my personal belongings were visible among the staged mess. When were these taken? I demanded. Last week, Mom, Karen said gently. You were having one of your bad days. Don't you remember? I didn't remember because it hadn't happened. My house was immaculate. My medications properly organized. My bills paid on time. But here was photographic evidence suggesting otherwise, and Dr. Chen was studying the images with growing concern. Double quotes Mrs. Sullivan. Do you recall your living conditions being like this? How could I argue with photographs? How could I prove that my own family had staged this evidence, created this false narrative, manufactured this entire deception? The doubt must have shown on my face, because Dr. Chen made a note that probably said something about patient's inconsistent memory and poor insight into her condition. After 90 minutes of character assassination, disguised as medical consultation, Dr. Chen delivered his preliminary assessment to Karen, not to me. Based on what I'm seeing and hearing, I'm recommending a comprehensive neurological workup. The cognitive testing shows some subtle deficits, and the behavioral changes you're describing are consistent with early-stage dementia. Karen nodded, gravely, squeezing my hand with false sympathy. What does this mean for her care? Doctor, she shouldn't be living alone. Financial decisions should be supervised, and given the paranoid ideation you've mentioned, it might be wise to limit her access to checkbooks and credit cards. Just like that, my independence was medically sanctioned away. Dr. Chen's recommendation would become legal justification for everything Karen and David had already begun implementing. Eleanor's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under my door like a covert operation. The familiar handwriting on the envelope made my heart race. It had been weeks since we'd spoken properly. Weeks since Karen had systematically sabotaged our friendship. My dearest Margaret, the letter began. I'm writing because something isn't right, and I need you to know that at least one person in this world still believes in your sanity. I clutched the paper with trembling hands, tears blurring my vision. Eleanor had noticed. After decades of friendship, she could see through Karen's manipulation where medical professionals had failed. I've known you for 30 years, and the woman Karen describes to me bears no resemblance to my brilliant, sharp-witted friend. When she called last week to cancel our coffee date, claiming you were having an episode, I knew something was deeply wrong. You don't have episodes, Margaret. You have opinions, insights, and a memory that puts people half your age to shame. Eleanor went on to describe Karen's campaign of character assassination. The careful way my daughter had been planting seeds of doubt about my mental state throughout our social circle. She'd told different people different stories, that I was becoming paranoid, that I was mixing up medications, that I'd accused her of stealing my jewelry. But here's the thing that doesn't add up, Eleanor continued. When I see you in your garden, when I wave to you from across the street, you look like yourself, alert, purposeful, completely present. It's only when Karen talks about you that this confused, declining woman appears. The letter was a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Eleanor saw what I was experiencing, understood the impossibility of my situation, recognized the systematic nature of the assault on my credibility. She included a phone number, her sister's house in Boston, and suggested I call if I needed someone to talk to, without Karen's interference. Use the phone at the library if you have to, she wrote. I suspect your calls are being monitored. She was right. I'd noticed Karen's increasing involvement in my phone conversations. The way she'd appear whenever I tried to call friends, offering to help me remember what I wanted to discuss. Gradually, my contact with the outside world had dwindled to almost nothing. That afternoon, I walked to the public library, something I hadn't done in months. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, greeted me warmly, another reminder that my supposed cognitive decline was invisible to people who weren't part of Karen's narrative. I dialed Eleanor's sister's number from a pay phone in the lobby, my hands shaking as I waited for someone to answer. Margaret. Eleanor's voice was full of relief and concern. Thank God you called. I've been so worried about you. The story poured out of me: the doctor visits, the forged documents, the missing bank statements, the sedatives in my tea. Eleanor listened without interruption, her occasional gasps of outrage confirming that my experiences were as horrific as I'd believed. This is elder abuse, she said firmly when I finished. Margaret, they're systematically destroying your life while making you look crazy for noticing it. Have you documented any of this? I told her about the recordings, the journal entries, the evidence I'd been collecting. Eleanor's relief was palpable. Good girl. That's the Margaret I know, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Now listen carefully. I'm going to give you some names, some resources, people who specialize in exactly this kind of situation. She dictated contact information for an elder abuse hotline, a lawyer who handled financial exploitation cases, and a private investigator who'd helped her neighbor deal with a similar family situation. But Margaret, you need to be careful. If they discover you're fighting back, they might escalate. Move faster to have you declared incompetent. Maybe try to institutionalize you immediately. The warning chilled me, but it also crystallized my resolve. I had a narrow window of opportunity before their trap closed completely. Every day I waited was another day they had to steal from me. Another day they had to poison more relationships. Another day they had to build their case against my sanity. I'm scared, Eleanor, I admitted. Of course you are. But you're also the woman who built a successful business from nothing, who raised a daughter as a single mother, who's survived every challenge life has thrown at you. You're stronger than they think, and smarter than they know. After hanging up, I sat in the library for an hour, pretending to read while actually planning my next moves. Eleanor was right. I needed to act quickly and carefully, but I also needed allies, people who could testify to my competence and clarity if this situation escalated to legal proceedings. Over the next week, I began carefully reaching out to other friends, testing the waters to see how deeply Karen's poison had spread. Some, like my former colleague Jeanne from the investment firm, had been completely convinced by Karen's stories. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry to hear about your diagnosis," Jeanne said when I called her office. Karen explained everything. "Please don't worry about your portfolio. She's handling everything beautifully." But others, like my neighbor Tom, who'd watched me expertly prune my rose bushes just days earlier, were puzzled by the narrative of decline they'd been fed. "You seem fine to me, Margaret," he said when I carefully broached the subject, sharp as ever. "In fact, you gave me excellent advice about my retirement planning just last month." These conversations revealed the breadth of Karen's deception, but also showed me that not everyone was buying her story. There were still people who knew the real me, who could serve as witnesses to my competence if needed. The most painful discovery came when I learned that Karen had contacted my church, my volunteer organizations, even my hairdresser, spinning the same tale of tragic cognitive decline. She'd systematically dismantled my entire social support network, isolating me from anyone who might notice her predatory behavior or offer me assistance. But Eleanor's letter had cracked open a door I'd thought was permanently sealed. I wasn't completely alone. I wasn't completely powerless. And most importantly, I wasn't actually losing my mind. The fight for my life was about to begin in earnest. The statements arrived by accident to clerical error that would expose the full scope of Karen and David's theft. The envelope was addressed to Karen at my house, but the postal worker had mistakenly delivered it to my mailbox instead. Inside were quarterly reports for investment accounts I didn't even know existed. My hands trembled as I spread the documents across my kitchen table. These weren't my accounts. There were new portfolios opened in Karen and David's names, funded by systematic transfers from my retirement savings. The paper trail was meticulous, showing monthly withdrawals of maximum allowable amounts, all bearing forged signatures that looked remarkably like my handwriting. The scope was staggering. Over the past 8 months, they'd moved nearly $400,000 from my accounts into their own investment portfolios, conservative blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, real estate investment trusts. They were building long-term wealth with my money, while simultaneously positioning me as too mentally incompetent to notice. I photographed every page with the small digital camera I'd purchased, my financial advisor training kicking in as I analyzed the devastating evidence. They hadn't just stolen money, they'd stolen it intelligently, diversifying their theft across multiple asset classes to minimize detection and maximize growth. But there was more. The statements included correspondence with the investment firm, letters purportedly from me authorizing the transfers and expressing concerns about my ability to manage my own finances. The handwriting was perfect, the tone convincingly befuddled, the content painting a picture of an elderly woman gratefully surrendering financial control to her capable daughter. Due to my increasing confusion about financial matters, one letter read, "I am requesting that my daughter Karen Matthews be granted full authority over my investment accounts. I trust her judgment completely and believe this arrangement is in my best interest." I had never written those words, never felt that confusion, never expressed that trust. But the forgery was so sophisticated that even I might have believed it was authentic if I hadn't known better. The phone rang as I was documenting the evidence. Karen's voice was bright and cheerful, with just a hint of concern that had become her default tone when speaking to me. Double quotes, "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today? I thought I'd stop by this afternoon to help you organize those papers you mentioned." What papers? I hadn't mentioned any papers, but I could hear David in the background and I realized this call was probably a fishing expedition to see if their misdirected mail had been discovered. "I'm feeling fine, dear," I said carefully. "What papers are you referring to?" "Oh, you know, just general financial things, bills, statements, that sort of thing. I know you've been feeling overwhelmed by all the paperwork lately." The gaslighting was so automatic now that she probably didn't even realize she was doing it. Every conversation was an opportunity to reinforce the narrative of my incompetence, to plant seeds of doubt about my memory and judgment. "Actually, I received some interesting mail today," I said, testing her reaction. "Investment statements that I don't remember opening." The silence on the other end was brief but telling. "Oh, those must be the accounts we set up for your future care, Mom. Remember? We discussed it after the doctor's appointment. You were worried about having enough money for medical expenses." Another lie, delivered with such casual confidence that it took my breath away. We had never discussed setting up accounts for my care, and I had never expressed worry about medical expenses. My health insurance was excellent, my savings substantial, my financial planning meticulous. "I don't recall that conversation," I said. "Well, that's exactly why we needed to take action," Karen replied smoothly. "These memory gaps are becoming more frequent. David and I are just trying to protect your assets while you're still able to benefit from them." After hanging up, I stared at the investment statements with new understanding. This wasn't just theft, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign to transfer my wealth to them while creating legal justification for their actions. Every forged document, every fabricated medical concern, every manipulated conversation was building toward a moment when they could claim complete control over my life and assets. I called the investment firm directly, using the customer service number on the statements. After navigating through several representatives, I reached someone who could access my original accounts. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm showing significant recent activity on your accounts," the representative said. "Multiple large transfers over the past several months, all properly authorized and documented." "I need to see those authorization documents," I said. "Can you email them to me?" "I'm sorry, but our records show that all correspondence is being directed to your daughter per your written request. For security reasons, I can't change that without proper documentation." Even my ability to access information about my own theft had been systematically eliminated. Karen had covered every angle, anticipated every possible avenue of discovery, planned for every contingency. But she had made one crucial mistake. The misdirected mail had given me concrete evidence of their scheme, documented proof that went far beyond he said, she said accusations. These weren't confused memories or paranoid delusions. These were bank statements, transfer authorizations, and investment records that told an unambiguous story of systematic financial exploitation. That evening, I spread all my evidence across the dining room table: bank statements showing unexplained withdrawals, medical reports with obvious coaching, recordings of their private conversations, photographs of staged evidence of my decline, and now these investment statements proving the scope of their theft. The pattern was clear and undeniable. This was elder abuse in its most sophisticated form, conducted by people who understood exactly how to exploit both legal systems and family relationships to achieve their goals. I had been viewing this situation as a family betrayal, a personal tragedy that I needed to endure or escape. But looking at the evidence spread before me, I realized this was something far more serious. This was a crime, meticulously planned and expertly executed by people who had studied my vulnerabilities and exploited them with clinical precision. The woman they were trying to portray as confused and helpless had just uncovered a financial conspiracy that would make headlines if it ever became public. The question was whether I had the courage to make it public, to fight back against my own daughter with the full force of the law. As I locked the evidence in my fireproof safe, I knew the answer. They had declared war on my autonomy, my dignity, and my sanity, It was time to return the favor. The letter sat on my desk for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. The return address showed Shady Oaks Memory Care Facility, and I knew with sickening certainty what I would find inside. My hands shook as I unfolded the professionally printed brochure and admission paperwork. We look forward to welcoming Margaret Sullivan to our community. The cover letter began, based on Dr. Chen's referral and the comprehensive care assessment provided by your family. We believe our specialized dementia program will provide the perfect environment for your mother's needs. The admission date was circled in red ink. 6 weeks from today, 6 weeks before they planned to warehouse me in a facility where my voice would be silenced forever, where my protests would be dismissed as symptoms of my condition, where I would slowly disappear while they enjoyed the fruits of their systematic theft. The brochure was glossy and inviting, full of smiling elderly residents engaged in supervised activities. But I knew the truth about places like Shady Oaks. Once you were admitted with a dementia diagnosis, leaving became nearly impossible. Families could visit when convenient. Staff could medicate you into compliance, and your wishes became irrelevant because you were no longer considered competent to make decisions. Karen had forged my signature on the preliminary admission forms. The handwriting was perfect, the tone grateful and resigned. According to these documents, I was eagerly anticipating the move, relieved to have professional care, grateful that my family was handling all the arrangements. I stared at that fabricated signature until the letters blurred together. This was my death warrant, signed in my own hand by someone who shared my DNA but felt no connection to my humanity. In 6 weeks, Margaret Sullivan would cease to exist as an autonomous person and become merely a problem, successfully managed. The despair that washed over me was unlike anything I'd experienced. Even when Robert died, his death had been a natural tragedy, painful but comprehensible. This was different. This was the deliberate murder of everything I was, while leaving my body intact to suffer through the process. I found myself in my bedroom that night, sitting on the edge of the bed Robert and I had shared for 30 years, holding the bottle of sleeping pills I'd been prescribed after his funeral. 20 small white tablets that could end this nightmare permanently, deny Karen and David their final victory, escape before they could complete their destruction of my identity. The bottle felt warm in my palm, and for a moment, the solution seemed so simple. No more fighting, no more documentation, no more watching my daughter perform concern while poisoning my relationships. Just peace, and the satisfaction of knowing they would inherit nothing but guilt. But as I sat there contemplating surrender, something shifted inside me. The rage that had been simmering beneath my fear suddenly blazed into fury. How dare they drive me to this point? How dare they make me consider destroying myself to escape their destruction of me? I thought about Eleanor's letter, about the friends who still believed in my sanity, about the 40 years I'd spent building a life that was worth defending. I thought about all the clients I'd protected from financial predators, all the elderly investors I'd helped navigate complex decisions, all the times I'd been the voice of reason in chaotic situations. This was what I'd trained for my entire career, protecting assets from people who would exploit them, recognizing patterns of financial abuse, building cases that would hold up in court. The difference was that this time, I was both the advisor and the client, the protector and the protected. I put the pills back in the medicine cabinet and returned to my desk. If Karen wanted a war, she would get one, but it would be fought on my terms, with my weapons, using skills she didn't even know I possessed. The first step was accepting that my daughter was no longer my daughter. She was my enemy, sophisticated and dangerous, but still bound by the same laws that governed everyone else. She had made mistakes, left evidence, underestimated her target. Those mistakes would be her downfall. I pulled out a fresh notebook and began writing. Not journal entries this time, but a strategic plan. I listed every piece of evidence I'd collected, every weakness in their scheme, every ally I could potentially recruit. I identified their timeline and their pressure points, their dependencies, and their vulnerabilities. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman whose protests could be dismissed as symptoms of mental decline. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd spent decades outmaneuvering financial predators far more sophisticated than they were. The sleeping pills had shown me something important. I wasn't afraid of death, I was afraid of helplessness. But helplessness was a choice, and I was choosing differently. Over the next week, I began implementing my counter-offensive. I opened a new safety deposit box at a different bank, one Karen didn't know about, and stored copies of all my evidence there. I researched elder abuse attorneys and private investigators, building a list of potential allies. I documented my daily activities and mental clarity, creating a record that would contradict their narrative of decline. Most importantly, I stopped drinking anything Karen prepared for me, stopped taking any medications she provided, stopped allowing her to control any aspect of my environment. The sedatives she'd been slipping me had been subtle, but cumulative, creating just enough confusion to support her claims. Without them, my mind felt clearer and sharper than it had in months. Karen noticed the change immediately. "You seem agitated today, Mom," she said during her next visit, studying my face with new concern. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling better than I have in weeks," I replied truthfully. The worry in her eyes wasn't maternal concern, it was the anxiety of a predator whose prey had suddenly become unpredictable. She'd expected me to be declining by now, becoming more confused and compliant as the admission date approached. Instead, I was more alert and assertive than I'd been since this nightmare began. That night, I overheard another phone conversation that confirmed my suspicions. "Something's changed with her," Karen told David. "She's not responding to the medication the way she was before. We might need to accelerate the timeline." "How much earlier can we move the admission?" "I'll call Shady Oaks tomorrow. If we can get her in within 2 weeks instead of 6, it might be safer." 2 weeks. They were panicking, rushing their timeline because their weapon of choice was no longer working. That panic would lead to mistakes, and mistakes would give me opportunities. I smiled in the darkness, feeling truly hopeful for the first time in months. The hunted had become the hunter, and the hunt was about to begin in earnest. Dr. Williams had no idea who I was when I walked into her office on that Tuesday morning. No preconceptions, no daughter whispering concerns in her ear, no files full of manufactured evidence, just a competent neurologist meeting a new patient who'd requested an independent evaluation. I'd found her through Eleanor's recommendation, a physician known for her integrity and her refusal to accept second-hand accounts of patient conditions. She insisted on forming her own opinions based on direct observation and clinical testing. Exactly what I needed. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, reviewing the basic information I'd provided. "I understand you're seeking a second opinion regarding some cognitive concerns. Can you tell me what prompted this evaluation?" I had rehearsed this moment carefully. Too much information would sound paranoid. Too little would seem evasive. I needed to thread the needle between transparency and credibility. "My family has expressed concerns about my memory and judgment," I said truthfully. "I've been evaluated by 2 other physicians who've suggested early-stage dementia. I wanted an independent assessment because I don't feel that diagnosis accurately reflects my current capabilities." Dr. Williams nodded, making notes. "Have you brought any previous medical records or test results?" "I wasn't able to obtain them," I said, which was also true. "My daughter has been managing my medical care, and the records are being sent to her rather than to me." Something in Dr. Williams' expression sharpened at that information. As someone who'd spent decades advocating for patient autonomy, she clearly found the idea of excluding a patient from their own medical information troubling. "That's unusual," she said carefully. "Patients have a legal right to access their own medical records. Would you like me to help you obtain copies?" I would appreciate that very much. The evaluation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. With the other doctors, Dr. Williams didn't have a daughter coaching my responses or providing alternative narratives for my behavior. There were no photographs of staged messes, no stories about forgotten conversations, no tearful performances about my declining condition. Instead, there was just me alert, articulate, and clearly competent answering questions about my medical history, my current symptoms, and my daily functioning. The cognitive tests were more comprehensive than the previous evaluations, designed to detect subtle deficits that might not be apparent in casual conversation. I excelled at every single assessment: memory tests, problem-solving exercises, spatial reasoning challenges. I performed at levels well above average for my age group. When Dr. Williams asked me to draw a clock, I created a perfect timepiece with all numbers correctly placed and hands showing the requested time. When she gave me a list of words to remember, I recalled them all in the correct order. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Sullivan, she said, after completing the battery of tests, "I'm not seeing any evidence of cognitive impairment. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning skills are sharp, and your mental processing speed is well within normal limits for someone of your age." The relief was so intense I nearly wept. After months of being told I was losing my mind, here was medical confirmation of what I'd known all along. My brain was functioning perfectly. Can you explain why two other physicians might have reached different conclusions? I asked. Dr. Williams frowned thoughtfully. Without seeing their evaluation methods or the information they based their assessments on, it's difficult to say. Sometimes family members can unconsciously influence medical evaluations by providing selective or biased information about a patient's functioning. She was being diplomatic, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. An experienced physician knew the difference between legitimate cognitive decline and manufactured concerns. Dr. Williams, I need to ask you something confidential, I said, deciding to take a calculated risk. If someone were trying to make me appear mentally incompetent for financial reasons, what would that look like medically? Her expression became very serious. That would be a form of elder abuse called medical gaslighting. It typically involves family members providing false information to physicians, sometimes combined with environmental manipulation or even medication interference. Are you suggesting that might be happening in your case? I'm not sure, I said carefully, but I've been having some concerning experiences that don't align with the medical opinions I've received. Dr. Williams leaned forward. Mrs. Sullivan, elder abuse is a serious crime, and medical professionals have a responsibility to report suspected cases. If you believe you're being manipulated or exploited, I can help you contact appropriate authorities. We talked for another 30 minutes about the warning signs of financial elder abuse, the legal protections available to seniors, and the resources she could recommend if I decided to pursue the matter further. She provided me with contact information for Adult Protective Services and a lawyer who specialized in elder rights. Most importantly, she documented her findings in a comprehensive report that contradicted everything Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chen had concluded. According to Dr. Williams' evaluation, I showed no signs of dementia, no cognitive impairment, and no indication of any condition that would justify limiting my autonomy or decision-making capacity. I'm going to send copies of this report to the physicians who evaluated you previously, she said. They need to know that their assessments may have been based on incomplete or inaccurate information. As I left her office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I had medical proof of my competence, professional validation of my concerns, and documentation that could counter Karen's narrative in any legal proceeding. But I also knew that this victory would accelerate Karen's timeline. Once she learned about my independent evaluation, she would realize that her medical justification for controlling my life was crumbling. She would have to act quickly before I could use Dr. Williams' findings to reclaim my autonomy. That evening, I called Eleanor from the library to share the news. I knew it. She said triumphantly, "I told you there was nothing wrong with your mind. Now you have proof. But Eleanor, this is going to make things more dangerous for me. Once Karen finds out about this evaluation, she'll know I'm fighting back." "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "Let her know. Let her understand that she's not dealing with a helpless victim anymore. You have allies, Margaret. You have evidence, and now you have medical documentation that proves you're competent to make your own decisions." She was right. The balance of power had shifted, even if Karen didn't know it yet. I was no longer playing defense, reacting to her manipulations, and trying to prove my sanity. I was building an offensive strategy, gathering weapons, preparing for the final confrontation. Dr. Williams' report was more than medical vindication, it was ammunition for the war. I was about to declare. The manila folder marked evidence file grew thicker each day as I methodically documented the scope of Karen and David's conspiracy. What had started as scattered suspicions had evolved into a comprehensive case file that would make any prosecutor salivate. I organized everything chronologically, creating a timeline that showed the systematic nature of their assault on my autonomy. Bank statements with unauthorized transfers, medical reports with coached responses, recordings of their private conversations about drugging me and stealing my assets, each piece of evidence built upon the last to reveal a pattern of premeditated elder abuse. The financial documents were particularly damning. I'd managed to obtain statements from 3 different banks, showing how they'd systematically moved money from my accounts to theirs, using forged authorizations. The amounts were staggering: over $600,000 transferred in 10 months, not including the real estate transactions they'd initiated without my knowledge. My house, valued at $400,000, was already under contract with a buyer David had allegedly found. The sale documents bore my signature, but I had never agreed to sell my home. They'd scheduled the closing for 2 weeks after my planned admission to Shady Oaks, ensuring I'd be safely institutionalized and unable to interfere with the transaction. The medical manipulation was equally well documented. I had recordings of Karen coaching David on what symptoms to report, discussions about which medications to slip into my food, and detailed plans for convincing multiple physicians that I was experiencing cognitive decline. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was the admission paperwork for Shady Oaks. They toured the facility without me, met with administrators to discuss my condition, and arranged for a room in the secure dementia ward where visitors were limited and residents couldn't leave unaccompanied. The monthly fees at Shady Oaks were $15,000. At that rate, even with the sale of my house and liquidation of my retirement accounts, my money would last approximately 8 years. After that, I would become a ward of the state, dependent on Medicaid and whatever public facility would accept me. Karen and David had literally calculated how long my life savings would last in institutional care. They'd planned not just my imprisonment, but my eventual abandonment once the money ran out. As I compiled this evidence, I began to understand the sophisticated nature of their scheme. This wasn't opportunistic greed, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign that exploited both legal systems and medical protocols designed to protect vulnerable seniors. They'd studied the process of obtaining guardianship over elderly relatives, researched which medical opinions would support their claims, and identified the precise sequence of steps needed to gain complete control over my life and assets. Every lie they'd told, every document they'd forged, every medical appointment they'd manipulated was part of a larger strategy. The witness statements I'd collected painted a devastating picture of their deception. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, had been told I was showing signs of severe confusion, and that Karen was heroically managing my care. My former colleagues at the investment firm had been informed that I was no longer capable of handling financial decisions, and that Karen was protecting me from making costly mistakes. But I'd also found allies who could testify to my competence. Tom, who lived across the street, had detailed records of our recent conversations about property taxes and investment strategies. My hairdresser, Sandra, had kept appointment logs showing that I'd never missed a scheduled visit or seemed confused about dates or times. Most importantly, I had Dr. Williams' comprehensive evaluation, which directly contradicted the medical opinions Karen had orchestrated. Her report didn't just clear me of cognitive impairment, it raised serious questions about how the previous physicians had reached their conclusions. The recordings were my secret weapon. Hours of Karen and David discussing their plans, celebrating their success, and revealing the calculated nature of their betrayal. Their own voices would condemn them. Their own words would prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. But evidence was only valuable if it could be presented effectively. I needed legal representation, someone who understood elder abuse cases and could navigate the complex intersection of family law, criminal prosecution, and financial recovery. I'd researched attorneys throughout the city, reading case histories and client testimonials. Elder law was a specialized field, and I needed someone with experience in both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. The lawyer would need to understand not just the legal aspects of my case, but the psychological manipulation tactics that had made the abuse possible. The private investigator Eleanor had recommended came highly credentialed. Tom Martinez specialized in financial fraud cases and had worked extensively with elder abuse victims. His initial consultation confirmed what I'd suspected. My case was exceptionally well documented, but also unusually sophisticated. Most elder abuse cases involve family members who get sloppy, he explained during our meeting at a coffee shop across town. They forge a few signatures, move some money around, hope nobody notices. Your daughter and son-in-law have created a comprehensive fraud scheme that would impress white-collar criminals. Tom's preliminary investigation had uncovered additional evidence I hadn't found. David had a history of financial schemes, including a previous bankruptcy and 2 civil judgments for fraud. Karen had been researching dementia symptoms and elder care facilities for over a year before implementing their plan. They didn't decide to exploit you spontaneously, Tom said. They studied how to do this, planned every detail, anticipated potential obstacles. This was premeditated elder abuse at the highest level. The scope of their preparation was both impressive and terrifying. They'd attended seminars on elder care, consulted with financial advisors about estate planning, even joined support groups for families dealing with dementia. They'd educated themselves thoroughly on their target's vulnerabilities before launching their attack. But their thoroughness would also be their downfall. Every research session left digital footprints. Every consultation created paper trails. Every lie could be cross-referenced against documented facts. The same attention to detail that had made their scheme so effective would ultimately provide the evidence needed to destroy them. As I organized the final pieces of evidence, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. I was about to wage war against my only child, expose her crimes to the world, and ensure that she faced serious legal consequences for her betrayal. But she had declared war on me first, attacking everything I valued, while wearing the mask of filial concern. I was simply choosing to fight back with weapons she hadn't anticipated, and skills she'd underestimated. The evidence was complete. The allies were identified. The legal strategy was forming. It was time to reveal that the confused, helpless victim they'd been manipulating was actually a predator they'd awakened, and she was about to hunt them down with ruthless precision. Tom Martinez didn't look like someone who could expose sophisticated financial crimes. He was average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd, which, he explained, was exactly what made him effective at surveillance work. We met at a small diner 20 miles from my neighborhood, far enough away that Karen couldn't accidentally spot us together. Tom had reviewed the preliminary evidence I'd provided, and his assessment was both encouraging and sobering. Mrs. Sullivan, in 30 years of investigation work. I've never seen a more comprehensive documentation of ongoing elder abuse, he said, spreading copies of my evidence across the table between us. Your daughter and son-in-law have committed multiple felonies, but they've also been extremely careful about creating plausible deniability. He pointed to the forged signatures on the financial documents. These aren't crude forgeries. Someone spent considerable time studying your handwriting, practicing these signatures, and the medical manipulation is sophisticated. They understood exactly how to present information to physicians to get the diagnoses they needed. Tom's preliminary investigation had already uncovered disturbing information about David's background: 3 previous marriages, each ending in acrimonious divorces involving disputes over assets, a pattern of targeting women with financial resources, gaining their trust, then systematically transferring their wealth to accounts he controlled. Karen may think she's his partner in this scheme, Tom said, but based on David's history, she's more likely his next victim. Once your money is fully transferred to accounts he controls, I'd expect him to find reasons to exclude her from accessing those funds. The thought that Karen might also be a victim complicated my feelings, but didn't change the reality of what they'd done to me. Regardless of David's ultimate intentions toward Karen, she had actively participated in destroying my life. Her motivations didn't excuse her actions. Tom's surveillance plan was methodical and comprehensive. He would document their daily activities, track their spending patterns, photograph any evidence of lifestyle upgrades funded by my stolen money, and attempt to record additional conversations that might reveal the scope of their crimes. The key is catching them in activities that contradict their claims about your condition, he explained. If they're telling people you need constant supervision because of dementia, but they're simultaneously taking luxury vacations with your money, that demonstrates consciousness of guilt. Over the next 2 weeks, Tom's reports revealed a lifestyle that was inconsistent with people genuinely concerned about a relative's medical condition, while supposedly managing my care and worrying about my deteriorating mental state. Karen and David were living lavishly. They'd purchased a new BMW with cash, a $40,000 transaction that coincided with a large withdrawal from my investment account. They'd booked a Caribbean cruise for the month after my scheduled admission to Shady Oaks, planning to celebrate their success while I was safely warehoused and unable to interfere with their enjoyment of my money. Tom had photographed them at expensive restaurants, luxury shopping centers, and real estate offices, where they were apparently looking at vacation properties. The contrast between their claimed concerns about my welfare and their obvious financial windfall would be devastating in court. But the most damning evidence came from Tom's electronic surveillance. Using legal methods, he'd managed to record several phone conversations that revealed the calculated nature of their scheme. The old bat is getting suspicious. David's voice was clear on the recording. She asked about the investment statements yesterday. We need to move the Shady Oaks timeline up. I've already called them, Karen replied. They can take her next week if we pay the expedited admission fee. It's expensive, but worth it to get her locked up before she causes more problems. Locked up, not admitted for care, not placed in a supportive environment. Locked up like a criminal whose only crime was possessing money they wanted to steal. Tom's investigation also revealed their contingency plans. If I somehow managed to avoid institutionalization, they had researched involuntary commitment procedures. If I tried to reclaim my financial accounts, they had prepared additional medical documentation to support claims of my incompetence. They've thought of everything, Tom reported during one of our clandestine meetings. Every potential obstacle has been anticipated and planned for, except one. What's that? They never considered that their victim might be smarter than they are. The surveillance had also uncovered their method for accessing my accounts. David had sophisticated forgery equipment in his home office: scanners, printers, and software designed to replicate signatures and official documents. They weren't just stealing from me. They were running a professional fraud operation. Most shocking was the discovery that I wasn't their only victim. Tom had identified at least 2 other elderly women who'd been targeted by similar schemes. Both had been successfully institutionalized after being declared incompetent. Both had their assets systematically liquidated, and both had died in care facilities after their money ran out. This is their business model, Tom explained grimly. They identify wealthy elderly women, preferably widows with limited family support, gain their trust, then execute this same playbook. You're not just a victim, you're part of a pattern. The realization that Karen and David were serial predators who'd killed before added urgency to my situation. They weren't just stealing my money, they were planning my death, albeit through institutional neglect rather than direct violence. Tom's final report was a masterpiece of investigative documentation. Financial records showing the flow of stolen money, surveillance photos demonstrating their lavish lifestyle, audio recordings revealing their true intentions, and background research proving their history of similar crimes. Double quotes Mrs. Sullivan. You have enough evidence to send them to prison for decades, Tom said as he presented his findings. But you need to act quickly. Based on their recorded conversations, they're planning to accelerate your institutionalization. Once you're in Shady Oaks with a dementia diagnosis, fighting back becomes exponentially more difficult. I stared at the comprehensive evidence file, feeling a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Here was proof that my daughter had planned my destruction as methodically as any business venture, that she'd calculated the value of my suffering in dollars and cents. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months power. For the first time since this nightmare began, I held all the cards. Karen and David had no idea their crimes had been documented, their conversations recorded, their history exposed. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman whose protests could be dismissed as symptoms of mental illness. They were about to discover they'd been hunting a lioness who was now ready to show them her claws. Sarah Chin's law office occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city where I'd built my career and raised my daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now hiring an attorney to protect myself from that same daughter. Sarah specialized in elder abuse cases with a reputation for aggressive prosecution and successful asset recovery. Her initial review of my evidence had prompted an immediate emergency consultation, and the urgency in her voice over the phone had both reassured and frightened me. Mrs. Sullivan, she said as I settled into the leather chair across from her mahogany desk. In 20 years of practicing elder law, I've never seen documentation this comprehensive or crimes this sophisticated. Your daughter and son-in-law have committed felonies that could result in decades of prison time. She spread Tom's surveillance photos across her desk, images of Karen and David celebrating at expensive restaurants, shopping for luxury goods, touring vacation properties. The visual contrast between their claimed concern for my welfare and their obvious financial celebration was stark and damning. The criminal charges are straightforward, Sarah continued. Financial exploitation of an elderly person, forgery, fraud, conspiracy, and potentially kidnapping, if we can prove the institutionalization plan was implemented against your will. But the civil recovery will be more complex. She explained that while the criminal prosecution would punish Karen and David for their crimes, recovering my stolen assets would require separate civil litigation. Some of the money had already been spent on their lifestyle upgrades, some had been transferred to offshore accounts, and some had been invested in properties that would need to be seized and liquidated. The good news is that Tom's investigation has traced most of the money, Sarah said. The bad news is that recovery will take time, and they're planning to accelerate their timeline. We need to act immediately to prevent further theft and protect you from forced institutionalization. Her strategy was multi-pronged and aggressive. First, emergency restraining orders to prevent them from accessing my accounts or property. Second, criminal complaints filed with both local police and the district attorney's office. Third, civil litigation to freeze their assets and recover my stolen funds. But Mrs. Sullivan, once we file these papers, there's no going back, Sarah warned. Your relationship with your daughter will be permanently destroyed. She'll face serious prison time if convicted. Are you prepared for that outcome? I thought about the recordings of Karen discussing my institutionalization, the forged documents bearing my signature, the systematic campaign to convince the world I was losing my mind. I thought about the two other women Tom had identified, who died alone in care facilities after Karen and David had stolen their life savings. She destroyed our relationship when she decided to steal my life. I said, I'm not sending my daughter to prison. I'm stopping a predator who happens to be my daughter. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's the right mindset for this kind of case. Now, let's discuss timing and strategy. The legal papers would be filed simultaneously to prevent Karen and David from destroying evidence or transferring additional assets. Once they realized their scheme had been exposed, police would serve the restraining orders and criminal complaints, while process servers deliver the civil litigation documents. The element of surprise is crucial. Sarah explained, they need to be caught completely off guard, with no opportunity to prepare defenses or hide evidence. Based on Tom's surveillance, they're planning to institutionalize you within days. We need to move first. She'd already contacted Dr. Williams, who'd agreed to provide expert testimony about the medical manipulation aspects of the case. Dr. Williams' evaluation directly contradicted the diagnoses Karen had orchestrated, providing medical evidence that I was competent and had been systematically misrepresented to other physicians. The media strategy was equally important. Elder abuse cases often generated significant public attention, and Sarah believed my case had elements that would resonate with journalists and advocacy groups. A successful financial advisor systematically exploited by her own daughter. With comprehensive documentation of the crimes, this story will write itself, Sarah said. Public attention will put additional pressure on prosecutors to pursue maximum penalties and might encourage other victims to come forward. But she also warned about the emotional toll of public exposure. My private family tragedy would become tabloid fodder, with journalists dissecting every aspect of my relationship with Karen and David. The humiliation of being portrayed as a victim might be almost as difficult as the original abuse. I've been humiliated for months, I replied. At least this time, it will serve a purpose. Sarah's timeline was aggressive, but necessary. Legal papers would be filed Monday morning, with service of process occurring simultaneously at Karen's house and David's office. Police would execute search warrants to seize their computers and financial records before they could destroy evidence. By Monday afternoon, their bank accounts will be frozen. Their assets will be under court protection, and they'll be facing serious criminal charges, Sarah said. But Mrs. Sullivan, you need to be prepared for their reaction. They'll probably try to contact you, maybe even threaten you. Do you have somewhere safe to stay while this plays out? Eleanor had already offered me her guest room, and Tom had suggested additional security measures to ensure my safety during the initial legal proceedings. The irony that I needed protection from my own daughter wasn't lost on me, but the recorded conversations had revealed a level of callousness that made anything possible. As I signed the retainer agreement and legal documents, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. After months of feeling helpless and isolated, I was finally fighting back with the full force of the legal system behind me. But I was also acknowledging that my daughter was irredeemably lost to me. The young woman I'd raised, educated, and loved had become someone capable of systematically destroying the person who'd sacrificed everything for her happiness. One more thing, Sarah said as I prepared to leave. When this story breaks, you're going to get calls from other families dealing with similar situations. Are you prepared to become a spokesperson for elder abuse victims? I hadn't considered that possibility, but the idea of helping other families avoid what I'd endured was appealing. If my nightmare could prevent others from suffering similar betrayals, perhaps some good could come from this tragedy. If it helps other people recognize the warning signs and protect themselves, then yes, I said. As the elevator descended from Sarah's office, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been a proud mother planning to leave my estate to my beloved daughter. Now I was a crime victim, preparing to send that same daughter to prison. But I'd also rediscovered my own strength, reclaimed my autonomy, and reminded myself that I was more than just someone's target. I was Margaret Sullivan, and I didn't surrender easily. The war was about to begin, and I intended to win. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:15 Monday morning, just as Sarah had predicted. Through my front window, I watched 2 police officers approach Karen's front door, legal documents in hand, while across town other officers were simultaneously serving papers to David at his office. I was safely positioned at Eleanor's house, watching through binoculars as my carefully orchestrated counterattack began. Tom sat beside me with his surveillance equipment, documenting every moment of what would likely be the most important day of this entire ordeal. Karen answered her door in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, clearly expecting another routine day of managing her supposedly demented mother. The confusion on her face when she saw the police officers was almost comical. She actually looked around as if they might be at the wrong address. The conversation at her doorstep was brief, but intense. I could see Karen's expression change, from confusion to shock to terror, as she realized the legal documents were related to her activities. She tried to close the door, but one of the officers stepped forward, continuing to explain the restraining orders and criminal complaints that had just upended her world. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Karen's voice was shrill with panic and rage. "Mom, please," she sobbed on Eleanor's doorstep. "I'm your daughter. I love you. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. David may have made some mistakes, but I was just trying to help you. Don't destroy our family over money." I watched from the window as Eleanor firmly but politely told Karen to leave and directed her to contact my attorney if she wanted to communicate further. The sight of my daughter, my child, reduced to begging on a stranger's doorstep was heartbreaking, but not enough to make me forget the recordings of her discussing my institutionalization or the forged documents bearing my signature. That evening, as news vans began appearing outside Karen's house and David's office, I received a call from the district attorney's office. The prosecutor handling my case wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my testimony and prepare for what would likely be a high-profile criminal trial. "Mrs. Sullivan," the prosecutor said, "based on the evidence your attorney has provided, this is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases we've ever seen. Your daughter and son-in-law are facing serious prison time, but only if you're willing to testify against them." "I'm willing," I said without hesitation, "even though it means testifying against your own daughter." I thought about the sleeping pills I'd considered taking, the isolation they'd imposed on me, the systematic destruction of my relationships and autonomy. I thought about the other women Tom had identified, who died alone in institutions after similar betrayals. "She stopped being my daughter when she decided I was worth more dead than alive," I said. "Now she's just another criminal who needs to face justice for her crimes." The confrontation was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews when I arrived for Karen and David's arraignment. What had started as a private family tragedy had become a public spectacle, with news outlets across the country covering the story of a daughter who'd systematically exploited her elderly mother. Sarah had warned me about the media attention, but seeing my personal nightmare transformed into entertainment was still jarring. Headlines screamed variations of daughter's dementia, deception, and the perfect crime that wasn't, while television reporters provided breathless updates about the sophisticated elder abuse scheme that shocked the community Inside the courtroom, Karen and David sat with their respective attorneys, looking far different from the confident predators they'd been just weeks earlier. Karen's designer clothes had been replaced with a conservative suit that screamed respectable daughter falsely accused, while David's usual arrogance had given way to nervous fidgeting and whispered conferences with his lawyer. The charges read by the prosecutor were extensive and damning: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery in the first degree, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and attempted false imprisonment. Each count carried significant prison time, and the prosecution was seeking maximum sentences. Your Honor, the district attorney announced, the defendants engaged in a systematic campaign of elder abuse that represents one of the most sophisticated and callous crimes this office has ever prosecuted. They manipulated medical professionals, forged legal documents, and planned to institutionalize their victim to prevent her from interfering with their theft of her life savings. Karen's attorney immediately requested bail, arguing that his client was a devoted daughter who'd made some poor decisions while trying to care for her supposedly declining mother. But Sarah had anticipated this strategy, and Dr. Williams was prepared to testify about my actual mental state. Dr. Williams, Sarah said during the hearing, based on your comprehensive evaluation of Mrs. Sullivan, what is your professional opinion regarding her cognitive function? Mrs. Sullivan shows no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment, Dr. Williams stated clearly. She performed exceptionally well on all cognitive assessments and demonstrates mental acuity well above average for her age group. Any previous diagnoses suggesting cognitive decline appear to have been based on false or manipulated information. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as the prosecution presented evidence of the scheme's sophistication. Bank records showing systematic theft, audio recordings of Karen and David discussing their plans, surveillance photos of their lavish spending, and Tom's investigation revealing their history of targeting elderly women. The court finds that both defendants represent a significant flight risk and a continued danger to elderly members of the community. The judge declared bail is denied pending trial. The look of shock on Karen's face was almost pitiable. She genuinely seemed to believe that her relationship to me would provide some protection from legal consequences, that family loyalty would somehow override the evidence of her crimes. David's reaction was pure rage. As the bailiff approached to escort him back to his cell, he turned toward the gallery, where I sat, and shouted, "This is all her fault. She's a vindictive old bitch who can't stand that." Someone finally stood up to her. The outburst only reinforced the judge's decision about bail and provided additional evidence of the defendants' lack of remorse for their actions. Over the following weeks, the case generated national attention. Elder advocacy groups held press conferences outside the courthouse, using my situation to highlight the growing problem of family financial abuse. Television programs featured experts discussing warning signs and protective measures, while newspaper editorials called for stronger laws protecting vulnerable seniors. I found myself thrust into an unwanted role as a spokesperson for elder abuse victims. Reporters wanted interviews, advocacy groups requested speaking engagements, and other families reached out to share their own stories of betrayal and exploitation. The most heartbreaking contacts came from elderly parents who recognized similar patterns in their own families, but felt powerless to protect themselves. Women who'd noticed their adult children taking increasing control over their finances. Men whose families had begun questioning their mental acuity whenever they made decisions the family disagreed with. "Mrs. Sullivan," one caller said through tears, "I think my son is doing exactly what your daughter did, but I don't know how to prove it. He says I'm imagining things, that I'm getting paranoid in my old age." These conversations reinforced my decision to pursue prosecution despite the personal cost. Karen and David weren't unique. They were part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior that targeted society's most vulnerable members. The pretrial proceedings revealed additional evidence of their crimes. Computer forensics had uncovered David's sophisticated forgery operation, including practice sheets, where he'd perfected my signature, and software designed to replicate official documents. They'd also found email correspondence with other potential victims, suggesting that their scheme was broader than originally suspected. Most damaging was the discovery of a detailed timeline they'd created, mapping out every step of their plan, from initial manipulation to final institutionalization. The document was titled Project Margaret and included contingency plans for various scenarios, including what to do if I became suspicious of their activities. Karen's attempts to generate sympathy became increasingly desperate as the trial date approached. Her attorney arranged interviews where she portrayed herself as a loving daughter overwhelmed by the challenge of caring for a declining parent. She claimed that any financial irregularities were the result of my giving her permission to help manage my affairs, but the recordings Tom had obtained contradicted every aspect of her public narrative. Her own voice discussing sedatives and institutionalization, her callous calculations about how long my money would last in a care facility, her plans to celebrate my imprisonment with a luxury vacation. David's strategy was to blame everything on Karen, claiming he'd been manipulated by a woman desperate to inherit her mother's wealth. But financial records showed that he'd been the primary architect of the scheme, with most of the stolen money flowing to accounts he controlled. The trial date was set for 6 months after their arrest, giving both prosecution and defense time to prepare their cases. Sarah was confident about the outcome, given the overwhelming evidence, but warned me that the defense would attempt to portray me as a vindictive mother, seeking revenge against a daughter who'd tried to help. They'll try to make you the villain, Sarah explained. They'll claim you're mentally unstable, that you're persecuting your own family, that this is all about money and control rather than justice. I was prepared for those attacks. After months of being gaslighted and manipulated, having my sanity questioned in a courtroom would be familiar territory. The difference was that this time, I had evidence, allies, and the truth on my side. The trial would be my opportunity to tell the world what Karen and David had done, to expose the sophisticated nature of elder abuse, and to ensure that other families wouldn't suffer similar betrayals. But more than anything, it would be my chance to reclaim my voice after months of being silenced by people who claimed to love me while systematically destroying everything I'd worked to build. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and every day brought new revelations that shocked even the seasoned court reporters who'd covered countless criminal cases. The prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence painted a picture of betrayal so systematic and callous that even Karen's attorney seemed uncomfortable defending her actions. My testimony came on day 4, and I felt the weight of months of manipulation and gaslighting as I took the witness stand. Karen sat just 20 feet away, no longer the concerned daughter, but a defendant in an orange jumpsuit, her eyes cold and calculating as I prepared to detail her crimes. Mrs. Sullivan, Sarah began, can you describe your relationship with your daughter Karen before these events began? I spoke about the sacrifices I'd made for Karen's education, the financial support I'd provided throughout her life, the love and trust that had made me vulnerable to her manipulation. Several jurors wiped their eyes as I described emptying my savings for her wedding and taking out loans to fund her lifestyle. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, but predictable. He attempted to portray me as a confused elderly woman whose accusations were the product of paranoid delusions, a vindictive mother seeking revenge against a daughter who'd tried to help. Mrs. Sullivan, Karen's attorney said with practiced sympathy, isn't it possible that your memory of these events has been affected by the stress of aging? That what you perceived as betrayal was actually your daughter's attempts to protect you from your own declining judgment. I had been preparing for this moment for months. Counselor, I spent 40 years as a financial advisor, helping people protect their assets from exactly the kind of exploitation your client perpetrated against me. My memory is excellent. My judgment is sound. And my documentation is comprehensive. Your client didn't try to protect me, she tried to destroy me. The recordings were played in court. Karen's voice clear and damning as she discussed sedating me, forging my signatures, and planning my institutionalization. The jury's expressions grew increasingly horrified as they heard her callous calculations about how long my money would last in a care facility. David's testimony was an exercise in deflection and blame shifting. He claimed Karen had manipulated him into participating in the scheme, that he'd believed her stories about my mental decline, that he'd been an unwitting pawn in her plan to inherit my wealth. But the financial evidence contradicted his claims. Most of the stolen money had flowed to accounts he controlled. The forgery equipment had been found in his home office, and Tom's investigation had revealed his history of targeting elderly women in previous relationships. Dr. Williams' testimony demolished the medical justification for their actions. She explained how Karen had coached previous physicians with false information, staged evidence of my decline, and manipulated the diagnostic process to generate reports supporting her narrative. In my professional opinion, Dr. Williams told the jury, Mrs. Sullivan was never experiencing cognitive decline. The medical opinions suggesting dementia were based on incomplete and deliberately misleading information provided by the defendants. The most powerful evidence came from other victims Tom had identified. Two families testified about similar schemes David had perpetrated against their elderly relatives, creating a pattern of predatory behavior that spanned decades. He befriended my mother, gained her trust, then systematically isolated her from family and friends. One woman testified, through tears, by the time we realized what was happening, she'd been placed in a care facility, and most of her money was gone. She died alone, convinced that everyone who loved her had abandoned her. Karen's defense crumbled as the evidence mounted. Her attorney's arguments about family loyalty and good intentions sounded increasingly hollow when contrasted with recordings of her discussing my imprisonment and spending my money on luxury vacations. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendants didn't just steal money, they stole a woman's autonomy, her dignity, and nearly her life. They convinced medical professionals that a brilliant, capable woman was losing her mind, all while systematically looting her life savings. Karen's attorney made a final desperate plea for mercy, arguing that his client was a loving daughter who'd made poor decisions while trying to care for a difficult parent. But the evidence had spoken too clearly. The recordings had been too damning. The pattern of abuse too systematic to support claims of good intentions. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, their expressions were grim and determined. The forewoman stood to deliver verdicts that would echo through elder advocacy circles. For years to come, we find the defendant Karen Matthews guilty on all counts. We find the defendant David Matthews guilty on all counts. Karen's composure finally cracked. She sobbed openly as the judge read the charges and their associated penalties. The reality of her situation finally penetrating the delusion that family relationships would protect her from consequences. David remained stone-faced until the judge announced his sentence: 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, full restitution of stolen assets, and lifetime prohibition from serving as anyone's financial agent or caregiver. Karen received 20 years with eligibility for parole after 15 years served. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly pointed. Ms. Matthews, you exploited the trust and love of the woman who gave you life, who sacrificed for your education and success, who deserved your protection in her golden years. Instead, you systematically destroyed her autonomy while stealing her life savings. Your actions represent a betrayal so profound that this court struggles to find adequate punishment. The civil restitution was comprehensive. Karen and David were ordered to return all stolen assets, forfeit any property purchased with my money, and pay additional damages for the emotional and psychological harm they'd inflicted. Sarah estimated that I would recover approximately 90% of my stolen assets, with the remainder lost to their spending and legal costs. But the financial recovery, while important, was secondary to the validation I felt watching them face consequences for their crimes. For months, they'd convinced the world that I was a confused old woman whose protests should be dismissed. The jury's verdict confirmed that I was a crime victim whose courage had exposed sophisticated predators. After the sentencing, I was approached by representatives from multiple elder advocacy organizations who wanted to partner with me on educational initiatives. My case had highlighted gaps in the legal system that allowed family members to exploit elderly relatives with minimal oversight. Mrs. Sullivan, one advocate, said, "Your willingness to fight back has already prevented other families from suffering similar betrayals. Would you consider working with us to strengthen elder protection laws?" I agreed immediately. If my nightmare could result in better protections for other seniors, if my documentation could help other families recognize warning signs, if my testimony could encourage other victims to speak up, then perhaps some good would come from this devastating betrayal. The trial was over. Justice had been served, but my real work was just beginning. I was no longer just Margaret Sullivan, retired financial advisor and crime victim. I was now Margaret Sullivan, elder advocate and survivor, determined to use my experience to protect others from the predators who target society's most vulnerable members. Karen and David had tried to destroy my life, but instead they'd given me a new purpose that would define my remaining years. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, and I intended to live very well indeed. 2 years have passed since Karen and David were sentenced, and my life has taken on a richness I never expected in my 70s. The house they tried to steal has become a sanctuary again, filled with genuine friends and meaningful purpose, rather than the isolation and manipulation that once characterized my days. Eleanor and I have resumed our Tuesday coffee tradition, though now our conversations often focus on the elder advocacy work that has become my passion. We've helped establish a support network for families dealing with financial exploitation, and our group has successfully intervened in 17 cases similar to mine. The new will I drafted after the trial reflects my transformed priorities and hard-earned wisdom, rather than leaving everything to family members who might view my death as a financial opportunity. I've created a trust that will fund elder protection programs for decades to come. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Elder Justice will be my true legacy, far more meaningful than any inheritance I might have left to ungrateful children. My work with the foundation has connected me with remarkable people, other survivors who've channeled their pain into purpose, attorneys who specialize in protecting vulnerable seniors, legislators working to strengthen elder abuse laws. These relationships are built on shared values and mutual respect rather than blood relations and financial expectations. The speaking engagements that initially felt overwhelming have become deeply rewarding. Last month, I addressed a conference of financial advisors about recognizing signs of family exploitation. The week before, I testified before a state legislative committee considering new protections for elderly clients. Mrs. Sullivan, a young advisor, approached me after one presentation. "My grandmother has been acting strangely lately, and now I'm wondering if my uncle might be manipulating her finances. Your story helped me recognize warning signs I might have missed." These conversations remind me why the public exposure was worthwhile. Every family that avoids what I experienced, every elderly person who maintains their autonomy because someone recognized manipulation tactics, every predator who's deterred by stronger legal protections, justifies the pain of reliving my story in courtrooms and conference rooms. The financial recovery exceeded Sarah's estimates. Karen and David's assets were liquidated to repay what they'd stolen, and additional civil judgments ensured I recovered approximately 95% of my losses. More importantly, the legal precedent set by my case has strengthened prosecution tools for similar crimes. I received a letter from Karen last month, forwarded through Sarah's office, written from federal prison. It was a mixture of self-pity and attempted manipulation that reminded me why cutting ties completely was the right decision. Mom, I think about you every day and regret the misunderstandings that led to this situation. She wrote, I hope someday you can forgive me and remember that I'm still your daughter who loves you. Misunderstandings, even facing decades in prison. She couldn't acknowledge the reality of what she'd done. There was no apology for the theft, no remorse for the psychological torture, no recognition that her actions had nearly driven me to suicide. Just continued manipulation disguised as filial affection. I didn't respond to the letter. Karen forfeited the right to call herself my daughter when she decided I was worth more dead than alive. She's simply another criminal now, serving time for crimes against a person who once loved her unconditionally. The real relationships in my life are with people who value me for who I am, rather than what I own. Tom has become a close friend, often joining Eleanor and me for dinner and sharing stories from his investigation work. Dr. Williams checks on me regularly, not as a patient, but as someone she genuinely cares about. Sarah and I have developed a partnership that extends far beyond my case. She handles the foundation's legal work pro bono, and I refer families dealing with exploitation to her practice. Together, we've helped dozens of people navigate the complex intersection of family relationships and financial abuse. The house they tried to steal has been renovated and upgraded, not because I needed the improvements, but because I wanted to reclaim every space they tried to control. The kitchen, where Karen drugged my tea, now features a coffee station, where friends gather for morning conversations. The living room, where David staged photographs of chaos, now hosts foundation board meetings and strategy sessions. My garden has become a source of particular pride. The roses they claimed I could no longer tend have flourished under my care, and I've added new varieties each season. Neighbors often stop to admire the flowers and chat about community events. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than manufactured concern. The safety deposit box at the bank now contains documents I chose to store their foundation paperwork, insurance policies, and copies of the will that reflects my actual wishes rather than forged papers designed to facilitate theft. Access requires my personal appearance and identification, protections I insisted upon after learning how easily financial institutions could be manipulated. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been less vigilant, if I hadn't recognized the warning signs, if I'd accepted their version of reality and surrendered my autonomy willingly. The thought chills me, but it also reinforces my commitment to helping others avoid that fate. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined. When we first filed incorporation papers, we've funded research into financial exploitation patterns, supported legal clinics for elder abuse victims, and lobbied for stronger protective legislation. The work gives my remaining years purpose and meaning that far exceeds anything I might have achieved in traditional retirement. Last week, I received a call from a woman in Oregon whose story sounded frighteningly familiar. Her adult son had been expressing concerns about her memory, scheduling unnecessary medical appointments, and gradually taking control of her finances. She'd read about my case online and recognized similar patterns in her own situation. Mrs. Sullivan, she said, I feel like I'm losing my mind, but I know something's wrong. Can you help me? I could, and I did. Within hours, Sarah had connected her with local resources. Tom had recommended a private investigator in her area, and our foundation had provided funding for her legal defense. 3 weeks later, her son was under investigation for elder abuse, and she was safely protected by court orders. These interventions are my real revenge against Karen and David. Every person we help, every family we protect, every predator we stop represents a victory over the forces that tried to destroy me. They thought they were dealing with a helpless victim, but they actually awakened a formidable advocate who would spend her remaining years protecting others from similar betrayals. As I write this final entry in what has become less a journal than a mission statement, I am surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and a future full of purpose. Eleanor is on her way over for coffee. Sarah is preparing for another foundation board meeting, and Tom is investigating a new case that might benefit from my experience. Karen and David tried to write the ending to my story, complete with institutional imprisonment and financial exploitation. Instead, they gave me the motivation to write my own ending, one filled with justice, purpose, and the satisfaction of knowing that their attempt to destroy me ultimately made me stronger than I'd ever been. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This one ends with justice and transformation. I am Margaret Sullivan, survivor and advocate, and my real life began the day I decided to fight back.